May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, our God and our sustainer. Please be seated. Both of my education backgrounds in psychology and religion taught me many important things, but one very important fact ran through both. We are the stories we tell ourselves. And even more so, we are the stories we tell about ourselves. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one who led you from Egypt to freedom in Israel. This verse has always struck me as one of the stories that God uses to define themselves to us. God defines themselves in the Old Testament, which is primarily what I studied, for those who haven't heard that before, with covenant promises and liberation. And there is no liberation greater than the Passover and the subsequent delivery from Egypt. It's worth noting that the story of the Passover and the Exodus is actually debated by scholars on whether or not it even happened. And I'm going to put a pin in that, and we're going to come back to that later. But the thing is, God in Exodus today calls the Israelites to commemorate that story. That is how important it is. They're supposed to eat a meal every single year. They get together, they eat this meal, and there's specific rules that go with it. That is how much God is defining themselves in liberation. And first, God calls for each household to take a lamb. And then God covers how it's to be handled if that household is too small to eat all of that lamb. You're supposed to join with your closest neighbor. So first it's feed yours, and then it's feed your neighbors, and then a very interesting direction is added. There is going to be no lamb left over at the end of this. None. And it said it's supposed to be burnt, but at no point does the word sacrifice come up. God is not asking for the leftovers to be given to them and burned as a sacrifice. God is just asking for it not to exist. And so there's a theory that scholars have, that I happen to believe, that God is actually trying to encourage there to be no waste, for there to be nothing left. Especially because, remember, the Jews are a people at this point who have been through slavery. They know hunger, so they're going to hate food waste. I don't care how rich you are, if you've come from that and that's your background at this point, you're going to hate food waste. It's going to make you sick. So what are you going to do? You're going to plan correctly. You're going to invite enough people. And so at that point, you're being encouraged to share of your bounty if you're in this position. So God has called you to then build a bigger table, as we would say today. Now remember, we started with feed your household, which at that time is going to include slaves, servants, family, extended family, that cousin you don't like. Now you're supposed to serve your neighbors. And now I'm being encouraged not to waste. Now, they've been doing this for thousands of years, and Jesus comes along. And Jesus has a Passover meal. That's what we talk about tonight. And he tweaks it. And he institutes communion, which we have every Sunday. And he calls us to repeat this with all believers. So he breaks us out of the tribe of Israel, and he grows the table exponentially larger. Household, neighborhood, tribe, and now the whole world is being called to the table, because God is always building a bigger table. A few weeks ago, my husband and I had the chance to have a very good friend over for dinner at our house, and we were able to meet his new girlfriend. And I absolutely love hostessing. it just makes me so happy. And I love being a good hostess. So I asked if there were any dietary restrictions. And the friend says, no dietary restrictions. A little later, we're discussing the plans a little more. And he's like, well, I'm a vegetarian. And I was planning on making chicken pot pie. So that plan's out. He was trying to be a good guest, and I really respect that, and I love that about him. But to be a good host, now I need to pivot. So I plan out spaghetti, marinara, eggplant parmigiana, and meatballs. Now I've added the meatballs and not just the eggplant parmigiana because my husband, who I love dearly and also want to make sure enjoys his food, isn't the biggest fan of eggplant. So now I'm having meatballs and eggplant, and you get to choose which, whatever you want and what's good for you. So I get back to my friend, and now I'm wise to the fact that my friend is trying to be a good guest and not give me any dietary restrictions. And I'm also on to the point that I know he's of Indian heritage, and I know his girlfriend's of Indian heritage. So I say, hey, are we good with beef meatballs? Or should I do chicken? And he says, good call about the beef. For context, if you don't know, culturally, Indians don't eat beef. It's a cultural taboo. So now I'm making chicken meatballs. And it's been an absolute joy for me to make sure that all my guests can eat and eat well. Because the most important thing wasn't what I served. It was that everyone was fed and fed well. There was food for everyone. That was what I would call the capital T truth. Capital T truth is the heart of the matter, the salvation matter that gives us life and that sustains life. Then you have these things called little t truths that I have been brought up to learn. And that is those little truths that get caught in our teeth when we eat the bread of life. And coming back for a good example of this is those scholars that were debating the historical truth of the Exodus. The thing is, I say this and everyone's probably jumping to assuming we're talking about modern scholars just trying to nitpick and tear things apart. The reality is rabbis have been debating it for centuries before that. Because in the Old Testament, they know that there are these narrative stories that aren't supposed to be taken literally, but had huge truth. And the rabbis themselves end up debating among themselves which ones they even are. But at the end of the day, they all come down, even after all that debating and all that everything, and they come to, it doesn't matter what really factually happened in a historical record. What matters is how God defines themselves. So when we look at the Exodus, what matters is that God has defined themselves as a God of liberation and has called us to be a liberated people. When we remember to focus on the capital T truth, then it's easier for us to give messages that invite everyone to the table. The truth is that I'm called to invite everyone and to feed everyone. But I don't need to feed them all the exact same menu. I can change the menu to meet their needs with what's healthy for them. Now, for 10 years, I have followed this mentality. And recently, I found myself admitting it was hard even for me to recognize and splice. And that I am capable of missing what's important and getting caught up in the minutia. An example that happened to me this week was this past Tuesday, I went to Chrism Mass at the cathedral with Father David. And this is a service that happens mid-Holy Week with the bishop and the clergy renew their vows and hopefully find some respite in the middle of Holy Week. And the chrism oil or holy oil is blessed by the bishop for the year. And when it comes to communion, something about me, I am a kneeler. I need to kneel when it's time for communion. I cannot stand standing. There's something inside of me, I just don't click with communion quite as well. It's a me thing. And I am blessed that here at St. Dunstan's we have the kneelers available and I get to kneel. And at the cathedral that day, The kneelers were right there and I could see them, but I was reading in the bulletin that we were all supposed to stand. We all had to take it standing. And I am ashamed to admit I seriously considered staying seated and not taking communion, and not following the commandment of my Lord Jesus to be present with that assembled body that I was there to worship with. The idea of standing for communion in that moment just hurt my heart that much. And there are probably people in this congregation that don't find kneeling for communion to be the right move for them. Some people aren't physically able, and if that's you and you also happen to be like me and need to kneel, you have my deepest sympathies. But on the other side, I know there are some people that feel more comfortable standing to take communion. And if that's you, that's amazing, that's great. Because it's great and fantastic that everyone is welcome here, that we make space for everyone. And I pray that we continue to be a church that gives that space and has that big enough table. But coming back to Tuesday, I had this moment where something clicked in me, and it clicked with me again when I listened to the gospel today, that it's about humility, and it's about being humble enough. And in that moment, my heart was opened, and I built a bigger table in myself to be able to worship with those gathered. I let go and let God and focused on the biggest truths. Because, again, and I know I sound like a broken record, God's always calling us to build the biggest table we can and to serve the menu that is healthiest for everyone at that table. And it can be messy sometimes. It's hard sometimes. It was hard for me on Tuesday. But it's what we need to do, because we cannot let the little t truths get in the way of the capital T truths of community and love and Jesus' call to love one another as he loved us. And when we do this, we are not only answering God's call, but we are also so blessed, because we will be finding deeper relationships and more relationships with each other and a deeper relationship with God and a bigger understanding of who God is. So I want to end as Father David always says when he invites people to the communion table. Wherever you are in your spiritual journey, however you found your way here, whatever the color of your skin, whether you live in a mansion or a tent, whomever you love, you are welcome at this humongous, biggest table that we have built, because there is food enough for all. Come and be fed.